When the ships arrived, the world held its breath. They weren't miracles of silver like science fiction had promised. They weren't sleek or graceful, nor did they glide like angels descending from heaven. They came as shadows, vast and jagged, tearing through the sky as though they had ripped holes in reality itself. Black monoliths, scarred and irregular, descended in silence until the air itself screamed against their weight. People everywhere stopped. In New York, commuters craned their necks upward, phones trembling in their hands as skyscrapers flickered with reflected fire. In Beijing, traffic stilled and a million horns died in unison as the smog parted under the vast outline of something older than fear. In the deserts of Sudan, shepherds raised their eyes to a sky split open by lightning without thunder. The ships, there were thousands, did not land. They hung like predators above the herd, casting shadows wide enough to drown entire cities. The air warped around them. Radios crackled and died. Satellites blinked out as if an unseen hand had smothered them. Then came the voice. It wasn't a voice humans could pin to any language. It was mechanical and cold, an amalgamation of tones, yet every person who heard it understood. It bypassed ears and went straight into the skull, a vibration in bone and thought. Submission or extinction. No explanation. No parley, no kindness. Just a verdict as though humanity had already been weighed and found lacking. The first hours were silence. Shock. Millions stood in streets, staring upward with slack jaws and numb hands. Parents clutched children closer. Lovers held each other without words. The rich, the poor, the powerful, the powerless. Every one of them was reduced to the same quiet terror. And then, inevitably, the panic came. Governments barked orders into failing radios. Soldiers scrambled into convoys. Fighter jets streaked into the air, proud wings rising against the darkness. They never returned. Every attempt to strike at the hovering ships was swallowed by invisible shields, swallowed and erased. Nuclear silos were armed in desperation, but even they fell silent as command systems flickered out like candles in a storm. It was not war. It was humiliation. Humanity's teeth had been pulled before the fight could even begin. On the ground, chaos bloomed. Looting, riots, prayers screamed into the night. Some threw themselves into churches, mosques, temples, pleading for salvation. Others cursed the skies, daring the invaders to finish it quickly. Humanity had been brought to its knees without a single bullet fired. And yet, in the ashes of fear, something small smoldered. It began as whispers, quiet and almost ashamed. In broken apartments and underground bunkers, in torch-lit villages and on stranded highways, people muttered to each other, "What if we fight anyway?" The idea seemed laughable at first. What could sticks and fire do against gods in the sky? What could blood and bone do against steel and shadow? But those whispers grew because fear does not stay still. Fear sharpens. Fear transforms. A firefighter in Boston, helmet cracked, carried 2 children from a burning bus and spat at the sky. A farmer in Ukraine buried his wife in silence, then dug up the old hunting rifles his father had hidden from Soviet days. A nurse in Lagos stitched wounds by lantern light, telling the broken and the bleeding that their pain was proof they still lived, and living meant defiance. The invaders had looked down and seen weakness. They had seen a herd to be culled, not a species to be resisted. They had judged too quickly, for humanity has always been underestimated. By predators in the dark of prehistory, by kings and empires who thought the people could not rise, by plagues, by fire, by famine. Again and again humanity had been pressed to the edge, and again it had bared its teeth. The black ships hung above the world, confident in their inevitable victory. But already beneath their shadows the embers of resistance were stirring. Already men and women whose names would never be remembered were setting their jaws and whispering the old promise of the human spirit. If you strike us down, we will rise again. If you burn us, we will burn brighter. If you demand our chains, we will break them in blood. The world held its breath that first day. And when it exhaled, it was not surrender that filled its lungs. It was the first ragged gasp of defiance. The sky burned. The ships hovered. Humanity trembled, but the story was only beginning. The first strikes were not meant to conquer. They were meant to shatter. When the black ships finally moved, their weapons did not roar with thunder or scream with fire. They whispered. Thin beams of pale light drifted downward like falling snow, brushing against steel, glass, and stone, and wherever the light touched, matter simply ceased. Skyscrapers folded in half like paper burned from the inside. Bridges dissolved into dust that fell soundlessly into rivers. Streets became craters in the blink of an eye, and entire neighborhoods were erased so neatly that even rubble had no time to exist. In New York, a tower fell without a sound and the dust swallowed everything it touched. In Tokyo, whole blocks collapsed into silence, leaving thousands screaming in the void where their homes had stood. In Cape Town, a stadium full of refugees became nothing but a smear of scorched earth. The aliens weren't conquering, they were teaching. Their message repeated across the minds of billions: submission or extinction. For many, hope died then. The internet faltered under the weight of fear. Screens filled with collapsing skylines and burning faces. Newscasters wept openly on camera before their feeds cut to static. Politicians gave speeches that sounded like prayers, begging people to remain calm while the world ended in slow motion. Yet in the ruins, amid choking smoke and broken streets, people began to move. Not in great armies, not with strategies or orders, but with stubborn, desperate instinct. In Boston, the firefighter, his name was Miguel, dragged bodies from a collapsed apartment building even as the flames burned his hands raw. A child clung to his neck, sobbing into the soot of his uniform. Miguel set her down in the arms of a stranger and whispered, "Run! Don't stop!" His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he turned back into the fire. In Lagos, the nurse, Aisha, used strips of her own clothing to bind wounds when the clinic ran out of bandages. Her voice, hoarse from smoke, carried through the chaos. "You are alive. That means you fight, even if all you can fight is the dark." She did not believe the words when she first said them, but she kept repeating them, and soon the wounded whispered them back. In Ukraine, the farmer Dmitro, who had never left his village in 50 years, picked through the rubble of his home. His wife was gone. His fields were black. He sat there until the night was thick around him. Then slowly, he dug up the old rifles buried beneath the barn. His hands shook, not from age, but from rage. When his neighbors came to him, lost and terrified, he placed a rifle in the hands of a boy no older than 16 and said, "If they want this land, they will bleed for it." These were not soldiers. They were not trained. They were broken, terrified people clinging to scraps of survival. But something stronger than fear burned in them. It was defiance. For every building that fell, someone pulled another from the rubble. For every child lost, another was shielded by desperate arms. For every voice silenced, another cried out in rage. And slowly something began to spread, not across governments, for governments were already crumbling, but across the human heart. A recognition, a clarity. The aliens thought fear would be enough, that by erasing hope they could end resistance before it began. But fear has never been simple. Fear makes you run, but it also makes you fight. Fear teaches you what you cannot lose. In a burned-out subway in Chicago, 20 survivors sat in darkness. The air stank of smoke and sweat. Some sobbed quietly. Some stared blankly at the flickering light of a single candle. Then one man, his arm in a crude sling, began to speak. His words were halting, rough, unplanned. "They think we're animals," he said. "Cattle, something to break. They don't know what happens when you corner an animal like us." Silence. The others looked at him. "They don't know that when you take away everything, when you burn it all down, people like us, we don't stay down. We fight, with teeth, with nails, with fire. We fight until nothing's left." No one answered. But no one turned away either. The candle flickered. Eyes that had been empty a moment ago began to glint with something else, something harder, sharper. The first strikes had shattered the world. But amid the rubble, amid the despair, the truth was beginning to take root. The invaders could destroy buildings. They could erase armies. They could silence governments. But they had not yet faced the one thing that could not be erased: the will of a people who refused to bow. Captain Miguel Reyes had flown helicopters through war zones before. Afghanistan, Somalia, places where the ground spat fire and the sky rained steel. He had carried men broken by shrapnel, watched towns swallowed in flames, and heard the crack of gunfire echo long into the night. He thought he knew fear. But when the invaders marched through New York, he understood he had been wrong his whole life. They didn't walk like men. They glided, tall and angular, their limbs jointed in ways that hurt the eyes. Their armor gleamed like glass, reflecting the shattered city around them. They had no faces, just smooth, eyeless plates where expressions should have been. When they turned their heads, the air itself seemed to recoil, and when they raised their weapons, there was no sound, no flash, only absence. Absence of walls, absence of flesh, absence of hope. Reyes crouched behind the rubble of a collapsed church, rifle across his knees. The city groaned around him, fires still chewing through the bones of skyscrapers. His squad, what remained of it, was scattered, half dead, half broken. His wife Elena had been on the other side of the city when the first beams fell. He didn't let himself imagine, didn't let himself ask. Some truths were heavier than the strongest soldier could bear. For hours he sat there in the darkness, his breath ragged, hands trembling. He had flown into combat before, but this was different. In war there was always the illusion of balance. You had a rifle, they had a rifle. You had tanks, they had tanks. Here, humanity's weapons were toys. Every bullet that pinged uselessly off alien glass only deepened the despair. The word crept into his mind like a poison. Surrender. Was it weakness or simply honesty? Could a species truly stand against gods who erased entire cities with the flick of a finger? Reyes thought of his wife, thought of the people still clinging to life in the ruins, and felt the crushing weight of futility. Maybe giving up wasn't cowardice. Maybe it was mercy. And then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, a faint murmur trembling in the smoke-filled air. But as he listened, he realized it was voices, human voices, soft and cracked. He followed the sound deeper into the church ruins. There, huddled in the corner where the roof had collapsed, were a handful of survivors. Their clothes were scorched, their faces streaked with ash. A single candle flickered between them. They were singing. The tune was broken, the words half forgotten. A hymn maybe, or a folk song, it didn't matter. Their voices quavered, some breaking into sobs, but they didn't stop. They clung to the notes like lifelines, pouring what little strength they had left into the act of refusing silence. Reyes froze. The weight in his chest shifted. For the first time in days, he felt something stir inside him that wasn't grief or despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was smaller, quieter. It was anger. Anger at the ships that burned his city. Anger at the faceless things that thought fear would break them. Anger that humanity had been written off as prey, as cattle, as something too weak to resist. He lowered himself beside the survivors. For a long time he said nothing, just listened. Their voices were thin, nearly swallowed by the darkness, but the sound filled a space inside him that had felt hollow for too long. When the song ended, a child turned to him. A boy, maybe 9 years old, soot streaking his cheeks. He looked at Reyes not with fear, but expectation, as if he believed absurdly, stubbornly, that Reyes would know what to do. That look broke something inside him. Or maybe it forged something new. He tightened his grip on the rifle. His hands were still shaking, but differently now, not from fear, but from the burning pressure of choice. He could walk away, let despair swallow him. Or he could stand, even if it meant dying with nothing but defiance in his chest. Reyes lifted his gaze to the broken ceiling, where the black ships loomed like vultures. He exhaled slowly. Fear wasn't the end. Fear was the fire that told you what mattered, and right now what mattered was simple. They would fight even if it killed them. The subway smelled of mildew and rust. Long since abandoned, the tunnels had become a graveyard of twisted metal and cracked tiles. A place where rats skittered in the shadows and dripping water echoed like the ticking of a clock. It was here that Reyes and his ragged band of survivors made their stand. They weren't an army. They were strays dragged together by circumstance, an old woman with arthritis, a teenager with hands that still shook when he touched a rifle, a mechanic who had never fired a gun before in his life. Their weapons were pitiful. A handful of hunting rifles, a few pistols, a crate of Molotov cocktails cobbled together from broken bottles and scavenged fuel. And rage. Rage was the one weapon they had in endless supply. Reyes stood at the mouth of the station, listening to the soft hum that signaled the approach of the enemy. His chest tightened. He looked at them, at the gaunt faces lit by the flicker of lanterns, and for a moment he wanted to call it off. What chance did they have? Then he saw the boy again, the same one from the church, soot still smudged across his cheek. The boy clutched a kitchen knife in trembling hands, eyes wide but unblinking. Reyes realized the truth. There was no calling it off. The fight was already inside them. All he could do was lead it. The invaders came with their usual precision, gliding down the cracked subway steps, glass-like armor glinting faintly in the dark. They moved like machines, confident, methodical, unaware that the air around them was thick with gasoline fumes and human hate. The first Molotov arced through the air like a falling star. It shattered against an alien's chest plate, and for the first time, Reyes heard something that sounded like pain. The creature staggered, its smooth surface suddenly alive with fire. Another bottle followed, then another, until the tunnel blazed with heat and smoke. Then came the gunfire. The old rifles cracked. Pistols barked. Bullets sparked and skittered against the glassy armor, but some found seams, joints at the neck, the bend of a limb. One alien fell, screeching in a voice like grinding steel. The invaders fired back, beams of absence cutting through concrete, searing holes into walls and flesh alike. The mechanic went down first, a hole in his chest where his heart had been. The teenager screamed and nearly bolted, but the old woman seized his arm with surprising strength and snarled, "Shoot, damn you." Together they emptied their rifles until the barrels smoked. Reyes moved like he was back in combat, ducking behind pillars, firing in bursts, then surging forward when the aliens faltered. He didn't think. He couldn't afford to. His world narrowed to one rhythm: strike, bleed, survive. And humanity struck with a savagery the invaders had not expected. A man with nothing but a crowbar leapt onto an alien's back, pounding again and again until glass splintered and black ichor sprayed across the tiles. The old woman, arthritis be damned, drove a screwdriver into an alien's throat seam and twisted until it convulsed in silence. The boy with the kitchen knife stabbed wildly, not caring where, his small body shuddering with every thrust. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't skill. It was teeth and fire, nails and rage. The pure animal defiance of a species cornered. When the last alien fell, the subway was thick with smoke, the air metallic with blood. Half the survivors lay dead or dying. The others stood in silence, staring at the carcasses of the creatures who had once seemed untouchable. Reyes looked down at the ruined armor, at the black blood pooling on the tiles, and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope. Hope was still too far. But certainty. The message had changed. Not submission or extinction. Now it was resistance or death. And for the first time, humanity chose death on its own terms. The survivors buried their dead in the dark, marking graves with scraps of metal pulled from the wreckage. They wept, their grief raw and heavy. But when the boy asked Reyes, was it worth it? Reyes put a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "They bleed. That's enough." Above them, the black ship still hung. The world was still burning. Humanity was still broken. But in one forgotten subway station, deep beneath the ruined bones of Chicago, the invaders had learned something they would never forget. Humans don't just die. They fight. Victory was never free. The subway ambush became a story whispered through the ruins. Survivors carried the tale like a spark in their hands. The aliens bleed, the aliens fall, the aliens are not gods. That spark ignited others. In Paris, men toppled an armored patrol with stolen fuel trucks. In Mumbai, women lured an alien unit into a textile mill and buried them under collapsing walls. Resistance was no longer a fantasy. It was fire spreading across the globe. But fire consumes everything it touches. Every victory left graves behind. Reyes buried the mechanic who had fought beside him, a man whose name he hadn't even learned until carving it into a sheet of twisted metal. David Chen, father, builder, fighter. The old woman who had driven her screwdriver into an alien's throat didn't survive the night. Her body too frail, her lungs too torn by smoke. She was laid beside him, her name scratched into the wall with a piece of broken rebar. The boy didn't cry. Not at first. He stared at the graves in silence, jaw clenched, fists white around his knife. When the others left, though, Reyes found him curled against the wall, sobbing so quietly it hurt to hear. It wasn't just the dead. Food grew scarce. Shelters collapsed. Winter winds slipped through shattered cities, cutting to the bone. Survivors picked through trash heaps for scraps. Gnawed on rats roasted over fires built from broken furniture. Water ran black in some places. Disease stalked the weakened, and always the sky hung heavy with ships, their shadows reminding everyone that tomorrow might not come. Some began to whisper again, not of resistance this time, but of surrender. Was it worth it? To fight meant to bleed. To defy meant to bury children, friends, lovers. If humanity fought to the last, would there even be anything left to save? In one broken neighborhood, Reyes listened to a group of survivors argue around a fire. Enough, a man muttered. His arm was gone, severed above the elbow. I've seen my wife turn to ash. My son shot dead. What's the point of more death? If they want our obedience, maybe it's better than this. A woman spat into the flames. Obedience is a slow death. They'll take our bodies, our work, our language. Soon we won't even be us anymore, the man glared. At least alive is alive. Reyes stayed quiet, staring into the flickering firelight. He understood both voices. The ache of loss was endless, and he carried his own grief like an iron weight. Elena's smile haunted him in the dark, a memory sharper than any blade. There were nights when he thought of laying down his rifle, of finding some corner to close his eyes and let the world pass without him. But each time, he remembered the look in the boy's eyes. The look of desperate expectation, of a child asking silently whether adults still had the strength to stand, and Reyes knew the truth. Surrender would not save the boy. It would kill him more slowly, more cruelly. Better a ruined world filled with free voices than a quiet one filled with chains. The next day, Reyes gathered those who still had strength. He told them no lies. We're not soldiers, he said, his voice hoarse. We don't win battles without cost. We bury too many. We lose too much. But if we give in, everything dies anyway. Better to stand and fall than kneel and fade. No one cheered. There were no speeches, no flags raised high. Just grim nods, weary eyes, and hands that gripped their weapons a little tighter. That was how humanity fought, not with fanfare, but with stubborn, bitter resolve. With people who woke up each morning expecting death and still chose to resist. With mothers who taught their children to hide during raids, then carried grenades beneath their coats. With children who learned to stay quiet in the dark, then stood sentry with knives too big for their hands. The cost of defiance was unbearable. Yet bearing it was the only way forward. At night, Reyes stood among the graves carved into the subway walls. He whispered their names under his breath like a prayer. David, Aisha, Fatima, Yusuf, Maria. Names lost to history. Names only he and a handful of others would ever remember. He thought of Elena, whose name he had not yet been able to carve. He closed his eyes, clenched his fists, and swore to her memory. If humanity had to walk through hell to remain human, then they would walk, even if the flames consumed them. The invaders learned quickly. The subway ambush, the uprisings in Paris and Mumbai, the sudden sparks of defiance. They were not victories large enough to threaten the empire, but they were enough to wound its pride. And pride for the conquerors was a dangerous thing. Their response was merciless. They unleashed new machines, predators on four limbs, sleek and faceless, with blades that hissed as they moved. Drones poured from the belly of ships, swarming like locusts, their eyes glowing red as they scanned heat and sound. Cities that had survived the first wave were methodically erased. Skies darkened with smoke as monuments and homes alike were leveled to ash. Humanity called it the shattering. Entire families vanished overnight. Camps of refugees were hunted down in forests and fields. Even whispers became dangerous. Any gathering of voices too loud could trigger a drone strike. Survivors learned to speak in murmurs, to cook with fires too small to be seen from above. to silence babies with cloth pressed against mouths. The aliens believed this escalation would break humanity, once and for all. They did not understand what they had created. For if humanity could not match them with strength, it would match them with cunning. In Brazil, guerrilla fighters lured hunter machines into swamps, where their weight dragged them under the muck. In Poland, an old coal mine became a labyrinth of traps, its tunnels collapsing on drones that dared to enter. In the mountains of Afghanistan, shepherds turned their herding dogs into scouts, their barks echoing through valleys to confuse alien sensors. Chaos became humanity's weapon. Reyes saw it firsthand in Chicago. The survivors had grown lean, their faces gaunt from hunger but their minds sharpened by necessity. Engineers scavenged alien wreckage, wiring scraps into bombs that shouldn't have worked but did. Children learned to leave decoys in the open, heat sources that drew drones into carefully prepared ambushes. One night, Reyes watched as a teenage girl rolled a metal drum down a ruined avenue. The drones above, sensing movement, descended in a cloud. The drum cracked open, releasing a cloud of ground glass dust invisible in the dark. The drone's sensors jammed instantly. The survivors waiting in the shadows opened fire, and for the first time the sky above Chicago went black with falling machines. Reyes smiled grimly. Humanity had always been dangerous, but cornered humanity, starved, grieving, desperate, was unstoppable. The invaders had expected order, clean battles, neat surrender. What they found was chaos. Beautiful, savage chaos. Reyes carried that lesson with him each night as he patrolled the ruins. Fear was still there, gnawing at his gut. Hunger was still there, tightening his chest. But alongside them now burned certainty. They could bleed the invaders. They could make them hurt. And if they could hurt them, then maybe, just maybe, they could drive them back. Still, the cost was unbearable. Each victory left bodies behind. Graves lined the subway walls. The names scratched deeper every week. Children who had once laughed in the ashes now carried rifles taller than themselves. Aisha, the nurse from Lagos, patched wounds until her hands shook with exhaustion, then collapsed beside her patients. When Reyes urged her to rest, she shook her head. "Rest is for the dead," she whispered. The dead were countless, and yet life persisted. One morning, Reyes climbed to the roof of a ruined apartment block. The sun rose weakly through a haze of smoke, painting the city in shades of gray. But on the rooftop across from him, a boy, 10 years old at most, stood waving a strip of cloth tied to a stick. It wasn't a flag, just a shred of color, but the boy waved it with stubborn pride as though daring the ships above to notice him. Reyes felt something break inside him, something that had been hardened too long. He laughed. It was a harsh sound, cracked and weary, but it was laughter all the same. The invaders had power beyond imagination, but humanity had something else. It had madness. It had hope. It had chaos, and against chaos even empires could crack. The shattering was meant to destroy humanity. Instead, it forged it. The war did not end in a single battle. There was no final victory, no flag raised over the smoking wreckage of an alien mothership. The invaders did not crumble overnight. They bled slowly, steadily, 1,000 cuts tearing away their certainty until pride became doubt, and doubt became retreat. One day, after years of fire and shadow, the ships began to leave. It was not announced. There was no warning. Survivors simply looked to the skies and saw the black monoliths rising, their jagged silhouettes pulling free of the clouds like teeth being yanked from flesh. They left behind silence, smoke, and ruin, and humanity. Earth was scarred beyond recognition. Cities were husks of twisted steel and shattered glass. Forests had burned to ash. Oceans frothed with oil and wreckage. Billions were gone. Families erased, cultures torn apart. Histories burned from memory. Yet still life clung to the rubble. Captain Reyes stood in the ruins of New York when the last ship vanished into the stratosphere. His rifle was slung across his back, though he had not fired it in days. Around him the city whispered with new sounds. Not gunfire, not screams. Children's laughter. He turned, and there they were. 3 children, barefoot and wild-haired, chasing each other through the skeletal remains of a skyscraper's frame. Their laughter rang high and clear, bouncing off broken stone like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The sight brought Reyes to his knees. His chest ached, not from hunger or exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of relief. They had survived. Against every calculation, every grim prediction, humanity still lived. That night, a gathering formed in the ruins of Central Park. Survivors lit fires from broken wood, their glow flickering against faces lean but alive. They shared what little food they had, scraps of bread, roasted roots, a few tins of beans. It was not a feast, but it was communion. Reyes watched them closely. They were scarred. Some had lost limbs. Others carried wounds deeper than flesh. Yet they smiled. They spoke softly. Some even sang. He remembered the first time he had heard survivors sing in the shattered church. Then their voices had been whispers trembling with fear. Now they were stronger. Rough, cracked, imperfect, but strong. As the firelight danced, Aisha sat beside him, her hands bandaged from endless work. She leaned close and murmured, "They thought breaking us would end us." Reyes nodded slowly. His eyes traced the faces around the fire. They forgot what it means to be human. He looked toward the sky, now empty of ships, the stars faintly piercing the haze. Once he had flown helicopters over battlefields, believing war was a matter of strategy, discipline, strength. Now he knew better. War at its heart was survival, and survival was not clean. It was savage. It was teeth and nails and fire. It was mothers who carried grenades beneath their coats. It was children who waved scraps of cloth like flags of defiance. It was people like the mechanic, the old woman, the boy with the knife. Ordinary, terrified souls who had chosen to fight anyway. The invaders had come confident, armed with technology beyond comprehension. But in their arrogance, they had mistaken humanity's fragility for weakness. They had thought fear would break them. They had thought hunger and loss would end them. They had not understood that fragility is where humanity's strength is born. That fear sharpens, that grief hardens, that chaos creates resilience no empire can control. The world would never be the same. Graves lined every road. Cultures had been torn apart. Languages silenced forever. Songs lost to smoke. But new songs would rise. New stories would be told. Humanity would rebuild, scarred but unbowed. Reyes closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to picture Elena's face. He saw her smiling, saw her holding him on the day they had married, sunlight spilling across her hair. The memory did not hurt this time. It burned, but it burned like a torch, something he could carry forward. He whispered her name to the stars, then he rose to his feet. The survivors around the fire looked at him, not as a captain, not as a leader, but as one of them. A man who had walked through fire and chosen to keep walking. Reyes spoke quietly, but his words carried through the night. They came confident. They thought us weak, but we fought savage, and in the end it was they who were left in ruins. No one cheered, no one shouted. They simply nodded, eyes bright with firelight and the reflection of stars. And as dawn crept across the broken city, painting the ruins in pale gold, humanity began to breathe again. The world was wounded but alive, and as long as it lived, it would fight, endure, rebuild.